Well, good morning or good afternoon. I apologize. And thank you all for being here. My name is Robert Palmer. I'm the General Counsel for the Iowa League of Cities. And I am going to talk about, hit the wrong one, the structure of civility. And I'm going to do so in three parts. What we're going to talk about is what would the structure of civility look like and what types of things should we think through as cities to try and get there. So first, we're going to begin the discussion by talking about what type of structure we need. We should understand what we're building the structure for. We need to know the why in order to know the what. So I'm going to begin by talking about the role of local government in our society to help frame that discussion and hopefully lead us to the type of structure we're seeking to build. Second, I'm going to talk about how to set the stage and build the stadium. Two analogies I like to use to describe how we can think about building a community that reduces tension and seeks to increase civility. And finally, even with the best intentions and the right structure in place, things can still get out of hand. So I'm going to conclude by giving an overview of the types of policies you may want to consider adopting locally. All right, jumping right in. So what is the role of local government? Well, I've always heard that where you're sitting determines where you will stand up. So I want to give you a little bit of an idea of my personal starting place for the comments today. I believe that we need to be more intentional about our form of government and what is required to maintain and sustain it. We can't get where we need to be or where we want to go if we don't know where we want to go. And we need to be intentional about what we have, what we want, and what it will take to get there. External, as well as our own internal polling shows that there is a perception that incivility is increasing and a fear that things are getting worse. I enunciate the word perception because whether you believe that incivility is increasing from a historical perspective or not, that perception still exists, and perceptions can have consequences. People report feeling more polarized, not just in politics, but in their communities and in places where they didn't seem to find as much friction before. Again, whether or not this tension exists within your own personal life or in your experiences, the people that we've talked to report feeling this way. And the way that people feel impacts how they will act, it impacts their expectations, and it impacts how they will perceive and interpret things. I believe that the human element is essential to this process. We've seen a lot of evolutions over the past year and years if we go back. So there's no telling how far AI will go. Certainly machine learning is one of the hot topics of this past year. But at this time, the human element is essential and is the basis of our form of government. I believe, in fact, I know that the public wants to be heard. We're all members of the public and we want to be heard. We want our government to be there and to be responsive to us. I believe that the distance between the public's expectation of being heard and their feeling of being heard is tension. That distance creates tension that we feel throughout our communities. I believe that life is too complicated. We need to make an effort to make things easier on people, not just because we owe it to them, but because if it's easier for them, then it will be easier for us because there will be less tension. Think about at the city level, how if you had provided the resources on that one issue that came up, maybe 5 calls wouldn't have occurred later. I believe that intentionality is important. Intentionality is knowing the results we want and then aligning our actions and our resources to get there. It's asking the question, will this action, what I'm doing right now, will it help us get towards that goal? Or is it going to make things harder on ourselves in the future? An example, turning off public comment may make a few city council meetings easier, but where are those voices and the tension that they represent going to go? Where is it going to be released? If it's not released, what kind of results will that cause within our community? So one of the questions I ask is, how can we be intentional about applying our structure in a way that empowers the human element? A few other places that I'm coming from. I speak on behalf of local governments throughout the year, and I believe that the purpose of government is to conduct the people's business. And I believe that government must be able to conduct that business, or the collective effort that we're all engaged in will fail. I also believe that when it comes to public participation and engagement, structure is needed to expand our abilities, not limit it. So let me explain through an illustration I like to use to describe scalability. I'll talk about one single issue in your community. And for this example, let's use a local government with 5,000 residents. So that's small by many standards when we look nationally, but it is larger than many of Iowa's over 930 communities. But 5,000 is a good number to use for this. So in Iowa, city council members are not paid very much, if at all. So most of them have other jobs, they have other commitments. This means that being a city council person is just one of the many things they are trying to balance in their lives. So we've got a city of 5,000 people, and we have a singular issue. That issue impacts 10% of our residents. So not large, but 10% of the people in our community are impacted. That's 500 residents are impacted by this policy. Thankfully, though, only 10% of the impacted people want to speak to the mayor, their city council person, the city manager, the clerk, whoever in the city they think represents the issue that they care about. So 10% of 500 is 50, and we've got 10% of those 10% that want to talk to us. That's 50 people. 1% of 5,000 people want to talk to you about an issue. I'm going to say that numerically, this sounds very reasonable. It sounds reasonable to say. I talk to legislators a lot in my day job. And so I can tell you that it would sound reasonable to the public to say that you should talk to 1% of the people in your community before you pass an ordinance. Now, I want to take the math the other way, though. We've got 50 people to talk to. Now, what's a reasonable amount of time? For this example, I'm going to use 5 minutes, but I think that most of you know 5 minutes is shorter than most of your interactions with constituents or residents who have a concern. Sometimes maybe it would be quicker if it's just in passing, but many of those meetings are going to be longer. But let's use 5 minutes for today's sake. We've got 50 times 5, 250 minutes. So we're at over 4 hours, I believe it's 4 hours and 10 minutes, but over 4 hours for one issue. Now, that was us only talking to 1% of the people in our community. It was 4 hours, and I think that in your communities, you interact with a lot more than one issue. So let's think about taking even a small number of those issues and extrapolating them out. Let's do 2 issues a month. That's an extra 8 hours on top of your family time, your job time, your other council commitments, those long council meetings, whether they're bi-weekly or once a month in your community. How much extra time do you have? It's already difficult to serve, and this is an extra burden. Now, we need to figure out how to meet this challenge. So this is an example where math and traditional engagement doesn't work. It's used to illustrate that we need to be innovative about our communications with the public, but it also shows why our current structure leaves so much of the public feeling as though they are not heard and they don't have access. This example also doesn't comment on any response time to a constituent or a resident. Are you going to tell them what you did to solve their issue or why solving it is outside of your abilities? I can tell you as a legislative advocate, I want you to be able to communicate with your resident about what's within your scope. Feedback is an important thing to be heard, so we need to see if we can solve some potential scalability issues. I'm going to turn my camera off and on real quick to see if it resumes. There we go. That looks like it's a little bit better picture. Additionally, I have a concern I want to share with you, and this is something that I saw coming out of the pandemic, but I'm sure you all have your own examples of where this could occur. My concern is that when faced with incivility, the business of government will be conducted, and in some ways I would contend that it has to be, but at the expense of public engagement, and that won't be intentional. And I've drawn a little chart here, but let's talk more about why that would occur. So what is incivility and what does it look like? Well, in some ways, it can be as simple as 2 people disagreeing with one another. But what we're talking about are things like the heckler's veto, which, if you're not familiar with that term, it's the disruption of a governmental meeting with the intention of stopping the policy action that is before that governmental body. Disregard for the structures that are in place to provide access to all such as time limits and set opportunities to speak, are the things that we see commonly. If I had time, I could show you many videos of insults, threats, and other harmful language that have been used at council meetings. And earlier today, we heard from a former and a current mayor who have both experienced much worse. All of this incivility and all of this tension has negative impacts on local government. It impacts the human element negatively. I think we all know that it is scary for elected and appointed officials, as well as members of the public, to be at one of the meetings that can be highly contentious. Believe me, members of the public do not like sitting through those meetings. Do not choose a contentious meeting to thank the council for their support or to ask for a simple zoning variance. You could be there for a very long time. It's also very scary to have someone yelling at you. It's also very scary to receive mail at your home or pictures of your house posted on social media. Those are all examples that we've heard firsthand. So when we look at the city, this can make it very hard for you to attract talent, both elected, because great people may not want to serve to have to put up with this, quite frankly, but also the employees that you're trying to attract. People don't want to work in tense environments, not to mention that in most cases with the city, they're going to have to work in person. So not only are they there in person, but now they're physically in an uncomfortable environment. There are places to work that don't require interacting with the public. And if you do attract that talent, it makes it hard to keep people. I know within the state of Iowa, we know of numerous great local government employees who are leaving in this month to go to private sector jobs. They found other opportunities that they felt worked better with their lives. It's hard to see that because we need great people. It also interrupts the conducting of business, cancellations, delays, tense confrontations. These make it difficult for the public to participate. We all share the amount of public comment time that's allotted. We all share the limited amount of time that our elected and appointed officials have to deal with the public. So when certain groups or individuals occupy that space, it reduces all of our collective ability to interact with our government. Finally, stability sells. There is a positive case to have civility in your community. You heard from my colleague Tiffany earlier today about the value of civility and stability in building community relationships and the type of things that can advance regional endeavors. Property values are maintained and increased more in communities that have stability. Economic development, those coveted dollars, the new restaurants, the new stores that everyone wants, those look for places with stability. If you're looking for a bank to invest your money, you're not going to choose the one that you think is insecure. Investments are the same way when it comes to those types of economic development projects. So what does this look like? We're gonna get to my analogies now of setting the stage and building the stadium. Our mission, and you're all here today, so you have chosen to accept it. The mission for building this structure is to maximize public input and participation while providing efficient governmental operations. We are public-facing entities, cities, counties, school districts, all governments, but particularly the local governments that we are talking to today, are public-facing entities. So it's very important for us to know what those expectations of the public are. I have some very bad news. We don't get to set the expectations. We as governmental entities are not setting the expectations of the public. The expectations of the public are and are increasingly going to be influenced by the private sector, outside the control of cities and government operators. If you can do all of your daily banking and purchasing from your phone, why should you go to City Hall to get a pool pass? As these differences between the public and private sector expand, how will the public interpret that? It's unlikely, in my opinion, to build confidence in government as that divide grows. The public will ask themselves, why can't government do what I expect to be able to be provided? And as I mentioned, those expectations are coming from elsewhere. So in many ways, governments will need to strive to move at the speed of business because that's what's setting the public demand and expectations. We can say government's different. We can hope and assume that the public will accept a double standard. But I would contend that the increase in the divide between expectations, which are set by others, and the reality of what we're able to provide leads to an increase in tension and incivility. So we want to close that gap as much as we possibly can. Now, I know with governments, I want to quickly say resources are one thing that we are finding a challenge constantly. I know that, and hopefully things can advance so that we can do more with less, but we do need to strive even under our resource challenges. So let's quickly think about our individual role within these policies through the example of setting the stage. Shakespeare wrote in As You Like It, all the world's a stage. And I personally love that saying. When we're acting on behalf of government in particular, we have very important roles. Within the policies that you adopt locally, you'll each have a role and you'll each have a part to play within the broader structure. Everyone has a role, and this is really important. Roles have responsibilities. It's important for you to know what your role and your responsibility is in the processes and policies that you adopt locally so that you can play your part. This is particularly important when it comes to tense times. We'll touch on that later. So let's move to something that people can relate a little bit more to today than Shakespeare, football. And I'm going to talk about the city as a stadium for civility. The stadium is where the game takes place. It's the structure of government that we're talking about. Many of the rules are set locally, but there are also many state and federal implications, and there are also expectations that are coming from external as well. Representative government is the name of the game. We have elections to help us determine who will be our elected officials, and we have public processes that govern who will be on the teams and who will be the players. Those can look differently in every state, but many states have something that governs public hiring. Citizens are both the players and the audience. I touched on this morning. You are both a governmental official, but also a citizen. I believe it was George Washington who said that we didn't give up citizen when we took on soldier. And that is a similar burden to what you have. You both operate your government, but you are also a citizen of it. Often, it is the mayor who serves as the quarterback calling the plays. But without the council, without the staff, no play can occur. That kind of goes back to knowing our roles and responsibilities. And when we talk about contentious times, knowing who is supposed to be controlling the ball can be very important. So the stadium provides the structure to the game, to this government process that we're doing. It's a physical building when we're thinking about the structure of a stadium and also of City Hall, but there's also non-physical, which is our rules and procedures. So, for example, fans are not allowed to rush the field. We see it after. It can be really fun at a college game, but that is not allowed. I've not done it, but my guess is that if you are caught doing it during a game, you will not be invited back to that stadium. Games are scheduled. They have a structure. There is a certain way that they operate. They only last so long. There are rules and parameters. The stadium also provides feedback for things such as facilitation. It is a place that can serve as a forum for meetings, sessions, committees, and other feedback opportunities. So, keeping going with this stadium analogy, before the game begins, the stadium is built and the stadium is there. The rules, procedures, and policies are developed. Staff is hired, everyone from the coach to the marketing department to the hot dog vendors. The elections have occurred, so we have our players, we know who they are, and very important, training has occurred. That's the first time I've mentioned training today, but you will hear me mention it because we don't know what our roles and responsibilities are if we haven't gone through training. So it is incumbent upon us to be trained so we know what those roles and responsibilities are. There's another aspect of the football game that I think local governments really can connect with, and that is that outreach is essential. Sure, we have local laws, but most of you do this because you want informed and engaged citizens. To be informed and engaged, a citizen must know how and when they can participate. Let me assure you, keeping with the football example, the NFL knows how to do this. You don't become a multi-billion-dollar corporation without showing people how to connect with you. Remove barriers to participation to make it easier on people. Going back to the game analogy, during the game, rules are followed and enforced. Everyone knows their role and responsibility. The quarterback is on the field, not in the parking lot directing cars or taking tickets. The fans are in the stand, not on the field. The NFL has done everything they can to remove the barriers for participation. Everything from selecting the television channels that it will be on to directing the game day traffic so that people can get to the stadium at a reasonable pace. So let's summarize the type of structure through the stadium analogy here. We need clearly defined rules, procedures, and processes. And we need to make sure that the public knows how to find them and that they can find them. I like to use the word compliability when talking about rules. You should strive to implement rules and policies which the public can comply with. In order to do that, those rules need to be transparent so that people know what to do. It can't be written in a foreign language where I'm not sure how to operate within your rules. And so people need to be able to understand the rule and then be able to follow it. One thing I think that's helpful for all of us to ask ourselves is, if you were a member of the public, would you be able to tell what's going on? And this is both for our rules, but also for the information that we want the public to be able to access. That's a big word here, access, being accessible. We need to be accessible so that the public can participate, which means they need to know how to participate. I want to make sure I comment that this is an area where things are changing, and it's increasingly important to meet the public where they are. How many of you stream your meetings live on the internet? I don't have the poll up, so you'll just have to answer that silently. I know many larger cities do, many medium cities are starting to do this, but many of our smallest communities can't afford to do that. The equipment is very expensive. We're going through that within our own office, and I know that it is outside the reach of many smaller communities. But the expectation is growing. During the pandemic, I attended a school board meeting virtually that had 1,200 people at it. I talked to a colleague after that, and they said that prior to that meeting, the most he could remember was 30. 30 to 1,200 is a level of public participation we should all be striving for. Finally, we need to be responsive to the public. We've all heard the phrase, if a tree falls in the woods. Well, I would ask you this in the modern era. If an email is not responded to, was it ever really received? It may have been, and the actions may have even been taken by the local government. You may have solved that individual's problem. But if they don't know that you've solved it, there's been no response, and they haven't received any type of feedback, have we given them a solution? Have we given them any type of productive response which helps to reduce the tension they feel or makes them feel more engaged? Another option that you can do if you have some, let's call them disgruntled citizen, is find ways to engage them. You can take unproductive energy and funnel it towards a productive cause. Do you have some citizens that are unhappy about parks? Get them together on a board and let them fundraise for your parks. What you should do is try to avoid a situation where there is a void created between you and the public, where they reach out or express a concern and there is no feedback back to them. I wanted to provide this as an example of some ways to potentially engage your public. You'll need to decide what's right for you, and each situation will require a little bit different way to engage. In fact, many of our communities should be doing all of these. They're all great, but I know they do take work. This is an area where a lot of technological advancement is occurring, and so I think there's going to be some really interesting new opportunities for community engagement in the future. My hope is that technology will allow us to do more with less and hopefully help our citizens feel engaged and productively involved. When it comes to policies, the most important thing you can remember is to have the policies, know the policies, and follow the policies. Rules, procedures, codes of conduct, these are all things to have built into the stadium before the game takes place. Have the policies in place before you need them, know the policies through training, and very, very important, follow the policies. It doesn't matter whether you have them and you know them if you choose not to follow them. From an attorney's perspective, not following them when you know them is a real head slapper. As you develop the policies, keep this balancing test in mind. On one side, we're talking about government conducting business. From a government's perspective, we are concerned with the efficient use of public resources. There is certainly a desire by government to maintain order. We want to do that so that we can ensure the efficient use of time, but also to provide safety and the feeling of security for all participants. On the other side is public engagement and access to government. Public expression, the right to petition the government, that representative part of our government, which I said was essential, we cannot forget about it. The more these things can be in balance, the better the policy. So we want to balance conducting governmental business with public engagement. When it comes to adopting a policy, one of the most important things you can do is not avoid it. I don't want to encourage anyone to adopt a policy before it's ready, but you do need to get on it. It is important to get started on that process. Your city is one incident away from needing a policy. I won't know which one. It depends on what situation you're being faced with. But you don't get to decide when that incident will occur. And I can tell you that policies are much easier to discuss when there isn't a feeling that they're personal and you're discussing them during non-contentious times. So begin these discussions internally, get a sense of how others in your community want to work, but engage broadly. I want to mention here that your elected officials are key. As staff, sometimes we like to get the work done and we can move it forward and then present something. But this is one of those areas where you need them to be in the driver's seat and have buy-in. Many of these policies will impact their operation. Balance getting business done with engaging your residents. And I would also tell you through the process, you may want to engage your city attorney. Seriously, though, there are issues with open meetings, open records, conflict of interest, and you're going to want to make sure that anything you put down is legally enforceable. So engage your legal counsel and do it right. As you're going through this, keep in mind, most of the time you won't need to recreate the wheel. I like the phrase steal from the best, but there's also phone a friend or consult a colleague. Reach out to someone who has been through it before. And finally, on these policies, strive for compliability. Adopt policies that people can comply with and try and make it easy for them to comply. We want the compliance, so let's lower the opportunity cost. I don't have time today to go through specific policies, but I did want to give a list of the type of policies that we're talking about. Just a few examples: meeting procedures and rules, codes of conduct, social media policy. One that's simple, but a lot of people don't think about, is a use of city property. Who can use the park? Can I campaign there? We had a city not too long ago that didn't have a policy, and so this question was more difficult than it will be when they're asked again. On public inquiries, who speaks to the press on behalf of the city? If there's a question from the press, are all of your city council members going to try and answer it? That can be very confusing and can send mixed messages. If you don't already have a code of conduct or rules for civil discourse in place, I would encourage you to consider adopting it. These policies are typically called council guidelines, norms, codes of conduct, and they typically contain sets of rules and expectations that are established by the local government on how you're going to govern your city. It defines civil and respectful governing culture and defines what is consistent with best practices. When developing this code of conduct, I recommend that you keep the themes of respect, transparency, and openness on your mind. Think about how to govern the various interactions that take place within your community. I've done quite a few arrows that go back and forth, but if you think about it, our interactions are complex. It's not just staff to staff or staff to a boss. It's staff to elected officials, staff to other staff, staff to the public, public to elected officials, and all around, sometimes all in the same rule together. Take these different relationships into account. Finally, determine what meeting governance will you use. Will you use Robert's Rules of Order? Will you develop your own custom operation? Have those in place so you have them to fall back on when you need them. Public comment is something I wanted to touch on because it is an area where tensions can occur. Iowa cities are not required to provide public comment at a city council meeting, but many of our members do. I know from talking to colleagues in other states that there are states that have public comment period requirements. For your public comment period, it is important to have a policy that the public can know that defines the parameters. If it's a complicated policy, find a way to make a public-facing document that makes it simple. How long do they speak? How do I sign up to speak? When do I speak? Whatever you need locally to make it so easy to comply with that you can make sure that you can enforce it. I would also recommend not to engage with the speakers during the public comment. This is their time to speak. You're offering the public an opportunity to express themselves. You have plenty of time to speak from the dais, so give them their opportunity. Earlier, I mentioned the value in ensuring members of the public don't feel that their emails or correspondence or public comments, quite frankly, have gone unnoticed. I'm not sure how many of you have done this prior, but I would encourage you to consider providing a feedback on public comments, whether that's to the individual or at a future council meeting, providing feedback on what initiatives were addressed coming out of the prior council meeting. Anything you can do to help the public follow things through your governmental processes helps them feel engaged, and feeling engaged reduces tension. Other things we should consider having is a rules of decorum. That can help maintain order during tense times. It clarifies unacceptable conduct. It has a mechanism to warn an individual, and it clearly explains the removal process. I would really recommend having a process and strongly consider having a script. This is an area where you don't want to mess it up. If you know that you have a contentious meeting coming, are you going to have public safety present? What level of public safety? Are you going to have them at the door or just in the room? You need to know prior to a tense meeting who is going to do what and when. This is the roles and responsibilities, and you need to know before you go. Let's touch a little bit on training. Training is needed. This is essential. You can't just have and know, because you won't know how to follow it unless you train on it. So we need to train our staff and our elected official. Training should help everyone know what their roles are, who does what and when, and go through a variety of scenarios. Host a boot camp on how to conduct a city council meeting. I'm pausing here in a live setting. I would listen to see if any of you are laughing. I know that we come in thinking we know how to conduct the city council meeting, but if you think back to your first city council meeting, or you think when you were a new elected official, you probably weren't very comfortable. So sometimes it's great to conduct that boot camp. These can also be great bonding exercises as well. Conduct a boot camp on how to maintain order during a contentious time, how to stay on task, how to deal with a wild card at one of your meetings, or how to deal with the public. Finally, with my remaining time here, I want to talk to you about what to do if a contentious meeting does arise. Let's start with the purpose of our meeting. So where you stand depends on where you are sitting. In order for us to manage a meeting, we need to start with the purpose of that meeting. Local government's goals in managing a meeting is to have a productive and efficient meeting with minimal disruption. To do that, the body, the governing body, will need to stay on task. I think we could also agree that governments like to avoid surprise as much as possible. So again, we need to stay on task. All right, we're walking into a meeting now. We talked earlier about local government being the structure and the human side. You know your role and you've got your responsibilities. You've done your training. You are about to walk on stage and your actions are important. How you act sets the tone for that meeting and for the public's engagement with it. It sets a precedent. In some ways, it lets the audience know what's allowable. You need to lead by example. Whatever happens, keep it professional and don't make it personal. On that last slide, you saw that picture. He was strutting in so proudly to that meeting, and rightfully so. They were walking into a meeting where they had the right structures in place and they were trained. Their city has a code of conduct that was properly developed. The agendas and policies are posted so the public knows when, where, and how to participate. The public knows their expectations, and the city has been trained. We want it to be all good, but we have to anticipate highly charged meetings and be prepared. Sometimes we may even have a heads up that these meetings are going to be more tense than usual. Maybe it's a specific issue. Maybe they have advertised that they're going to disrupt a meeting. Educate your council members and your staff ahead of time on anything you know like that, and also work with the police department if you believe that there could be some type of threat or risk. My colleague Scott is going to touch on a civility pledge, but I would simply at this time say, read the rules at the beginning of the meeting. Read your civility pledge. Ensure that they are clear and everyone has notice. Give them the opportunity at the beginning of the meeting to reset themselves based on the rules and structure you have provided. All right, we're in the meeting. We know we're there to conduct business, and we're going to lead in our role in setting the example that we're going to see. We open the meeting by summarizing the public comment rules, our expectations for the public, progressing levels of enforcement should they be necessary. We make sure that everyone is on notice. Many cities utilize a civility pledge for this. What you're going to want to do is to stay on task. This is both leading by example, but also being respectful of everyone's time. Follow the agenda. Again, this isn't just to say on task because you're a government. There are people who have come to give their time to participate and engage with their government. So we need to be respectful of their time. You don't want to be caught breaking your own rules when things get tense. This is where the follow of have, know, and follow becomes important. And if things do get tense, default to training. Times of intense stress are not a time to get creative. Stay in your role. If someone else is supposed to take charge, let them do so. If you are supposed to take charge, do so. Follow the script, both literally if you've prepared it, or figuratively based on your role and responsibility. Scripts I've seen have motions and options ready, a motion to revise the agenda, a motion to approve multiple items at once, a script on how to handle an unruly attendee, and very important, a script on how to handle ejection procedures. I want to state that an ejection is a very serious matter. So we know that we're leading by example. If you start yelling, so will the crowd. If tensions arise, try and proceed if you can, despite the disruptions. If the heckler's veto is successful, that's the stopping of the conducting of governmental business, then you risk it becoming a repeated tactic used against you. It is better to proceed if possible than to face repeated disrupted meetings. If you must eject, have a script. You want to warn ahead of time, several times. When appropriate, ask the disruptors to leave. Warn that failure to leave can result in trespassing. I'm an attorney, so I have to tell you that this can be very costly if it's done inappropriately. There are several court cases out there on this issue. It also pains me to say it this way, but when tensions arise, act like your city attorney. Be more boring, be more mundane. Don't get creative, and don't try and rise to the occasion, so to speak. And in conclusion, have, know, follow. Be prepared. Have those policies in place before you need them. Know that the public wants to be heard. Listen and provide opportunities for that. Provide responses so the public feels heard. Focus on structure, not responding to a specific issue of the day. Have a facilitator mentality. How can we make this happen? Start from there, and there'll be less tension as you move forward. And finally, think about future possibilities of how we can do this better. One of my favorite quotes is better every day. I like to believe that because everything I do, I think I can improve from it. That's how we should be looking at what we're doing today and what we can do with technology that's coming in the future.